Welcome to Unstitching ADHD Urban Ed Talks, where we explore strategies to support students with ADHD in urban schools. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Ekiyor. We have a special guest today, Angelica Matias from the Student Support Services Department in a New York State urban school district. Angelica is a leader in implementing restorative practices to create supportive environments for students, particularly those with ADHD. Today, she will share insights on how these practices can benefit students with ADHD, the challenges they face, and success stories from her experience. Angelica, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Stanley.
Let's start with you introducing yourself and telling us how your work in restorative practices has shaped your approach towards supporting students with ADHD and
Absolutely. I have been an urban educator for over 15 years now, and my journey with restorative practices began almost a decade ago. I learned about restorative practices through a program that I was in at the University of Rochester, an educational policy program there, and actually was able to do some research and learn more about policies in terms of implementing restorative practices across the country. I became very interested in applying those practices to my work with students. At the time, I was co-teaching in a classroom with students who were identified as being on the autism spectrum. And so that was my first experience with implementing restorative practices, very much in a setting where we had to be very conscious of certain adjustments to work with students who were on the spectrum, as well as general education students, some who had other, diagnoses and things as well. So I learned a lot about how to take restorative practices and make it accessible for students with different needs through that experience.
Thank you. So most people hear restorative practices and they wonder, what are restorative practices and how can they benefit students with ADHD? Can you share a little light on that?
Absolutely. So I would say that, for starters, just emphasizing what is restorative practices. So restorative practices are essentially any practice that helps to build relationships, strengthen existing relationships, and repair relationships when any harm has occurred, right? Interpersonal harm has occurred. So the concept being that relationship and community are central to the well-being of all our students. Feeling welcomed and valued in their educational setting is foundational for real academic success. It's not separate from students' academic learning, but is something that is used to support that academic learning. Any practice, proactive or responsive, that aims to achieve the goals of building and strengthening relationships to ultimately allow students to feel like they are in a safe, valued, and caring environment where they can learn, make mistakes, and have options and paths to become be in right relationship with classmates, with their educators, paths to do that is critically important for students to be able to learn and be academically successful. So really, when it comes to restorative practices and how it can benefit students with ADHD, I would say it could benefit them in the same ways that it benefits any student or human being. But I would think that even more so for students with ADHD or any other kind of special needs or diagnosis, it really is about finding the way to give them access to those practices that's really going to address what their needs are and allow them to have successful relationships in the classroom. So any modifications around things like previewing certain information, making sure that they have an awareness of the expectations are incredibly clear about any processes that are going to happen. And then also allowing flexibility within those processes that will keep the meaning of the process, right? It'll still be a very relevant and impactful process, but how can we make it more accessible for students who may have issues with attention? Part of what I think is so critical about restorative practices is this concept of accountability. And what does that look like? And I think that may be one of the biggest ways to consider how it would impact students with ADHD or other needs, because how do we make sure that we're holding them accountable to the process and to the practice, but also providing the appropriate level of support for the type of flexibility they may need. For example, if we're sitting in a community building circle as an example of restorative practice that can be utilized in schools, and a child is finding themselves to be overstimulated or unfocused and not able to attend to the guidelines that have been established for that circle, right? You want to have proactively had conversations and built guidelines that allow that student to self-identify and say, you know what, I need to step away. Implement a process for how they would take that break, how they would time that break, how would they check in and be able to determine that they're ready to return to that process and rejoin their classmates if they need to exit, and give themselves some time to hold themselves accountable to the guidelines that were agreed on for the time together in circles. Those structures and guidelines are relevant to all students' needs in the classroom.
So I've heard teachers say students with ADHD don't belong in the general ed population. I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on practices and a success story of a student where restorative practices strategies have made a difference.
Absolutely. I would say the biggest way to describe success for a student with ADHD in the classroom is to witness a student who is not only academically successful, but someone who feels really fully integrated and a part, that they have strong relationships with their peers. That is foundational to them being able to experience academic success because they're not consumed with social issues and with their classmates. I would say a success story that I experienced as an educator in terms of us supporting a student with ADHD and utilizing these practices has really been the most beneficial thing, has been what we do proactively, those practices. So for one, it's about understanding that restorative practices is about building the capacity of students and, social emotional learning. Since COVID, the importance of educators making time to address the social emotional learning and needs of students. And I think one of the biggest components under that umbrella is about communication, building the capacity of our students to communicate their own feelings and needs, and being able to interact interpersonally, right, in a way where they can see and value and hear others and have that type of connection with folks. So I would say that the first kind of piece of restorative that I found to be incredibly successful in terms of working with students with ADHD is about helping them build their emotional vocabulary. There's a lot going on, right, for those students, right? A lot of things coming in at them that they're absorbing at any given point in time. Being able to provide them with language that allows them to express what they're feeling, what they're needing, as opposed to expressing those needs through behaviors and actions, right? That in and of itself is going to shift that student's experience in an educational setting significantly when they have access to that language. I think the other really important thing to understand is students with ADHD are very capable of accessing that language, of accessing those skills. And that once we provide the skill, we can have the expectation, so long as we provide an environment that is truly welcoming of hearing those students' voices, because those students' voices often are not heard because we're considering more of the behavioral challenges and maybe even assuming different motivations for behavior. And so we then respond accordingly. We're trying to do something to improve their educational experience, as opposed to really understanding that they are very capable of advocating for themselves, of expressing their feelings and needs. And so in addition to just providing the skills, we have to provide the space and the response to their communication where they will want to continue to communicate in that way. They will feel like, yeah, these people in this space want to hear from me about how I'm feeling and what I'm needing, and will respond to that when I communicate that appropriately to them. And so they automatically know and have that reinforced, right? I have the skills and I'm in a space where there are individuals around me who very much encourage me to have my voice heard in terms of feelings and needs. So I think that's probably one of the largest transformations I've been able to witness in terms of working directly with students. I've seen a difference made both ways. Whether a child is medicated or not, when we are implementing restorative practice, makes a difference in terms of their ability to advocate for themselves and express feelings and needs and navigate social relationships in the classroom better.
Mhm, mhm. I'm glad you brought the topic of the environment. A wise person once said, students with disability do not create disability. It's the environment that creates the disability. So I am wondering, in your district, how do you support teachers, administrators? What tools do you have at your disposal to make sure you're building capacity to help the environment become inclusive for
Mm-hmm.
students with ADHD?
Yes, absolutely. So a few of the things, I mean, we have an entire team of individuals who have a range of experiences in terms of teaching, education, certifications, folks who, have worked with special ed students, high school students, middle school students, elementary students. We have a team that is really just has a lots of years cumulative experience working with students. And that team goes out into schools and models practices with teachers seeking support. In addition to the professional learning we do with educators and administrators, we go into classroom spaces and work directly with educators to kind of just show them, how do we make this a reality? How do we make these practices accessible to all students? It can be really useful because just being in those moments of working, we can show when things don't go perfectly and how do we troubleshoot and how do we remain flexible to the needs of the students, even if we have a specific plan, right? We talk a lot about the idea of flexibility. A plan is important because you want to put thought in and try and do your best to anticipate needs based on what you know about students and the relationships you have. It is also important to remain flexible in that plan to make appropriate adjustments as things are being done. So I think the modeling component is probably one of the strongest things that we do to support educators in terms of the environment. Sometimes we'll have an educator say, I'm having a tough time with a particular student. We'll go and observe and provide feedback based on the experiences that we've had and we've seen in terms of adjustments that the educator can make to the classroom environment to make restorative practices a more natural part of the culture of that space and just ways specifically to make it accessible to individual students. Sometimes we'll even offer to come in and meet with a student or two that is having some challenges accessing those restorative practices, participating in those types of things with their classmates. And so we'll start off in very small groups with those students. So instead of a large classroom and they're trying to kind of pick up on these new guidelines and practices in a large group, where we are asking them to be rather communicative. We're asking them to be vulnerable. We're asking them to really connect with their peers. A new process can be really overwhelming. Making sure to account for a way to introduce students with ADHD to that process in a setting that is less intimidating can help normalize the process for them and give them more space to ask questions or express what they need during a process like that. If we were to go back into the classroom and do this with a whole class, what might be challenging for you? What support might you need from your classmates and your teacher to be a successful part of this process with your class to fully engage? And so we can have an opportunity to pre-conference and give them the heads up about what to expect and ask them to state directly, instead of just making assumptions about what they might need, what do you think, if this is what we were going to try it all together, what might be challenging for you? What can we do to support you to make this process a process that you would want to engage in and be a part of with your classmates? Those are just some of the ways we can go in and support educators in terms of the environment, and specifically how we support students with ADHD or other needs to access what we want all students in that space to be able to access.
That's insightful. What advice do you have for educators and school administrators looking to implement restorative practices to better support students with ADHD?
My advice would be ultimately connect with other individuals about supporting those students. Use the resources that you have within your building and your school community, your district community. Really look for individuals who are well versed and well experienced in restorative, because I think it's about continuing to build those connections and relationships, and then learning from each other what works, right? What we can try, how we can support, each other in terms of then supporting our students. One is just make connections. If you feel your knowledge or experience with restorative practices is limited, I can almost guarantee that in every school there is at least one individual who is passionate about the work restorative practices is about. Connect with that individual to learn more. Visiting classrooms where, teachers are kind of a model classroom may exist right down the hall, So talking and finding out, again, who's passionate about these things, where are the teachers who are experienced and are doing this and finding success and making these practices accessible for all students, and having an opportunity to observe is one piece that is really critical, because it's about the relationships, even when we're learning about relationships and how to give our students better access to that. Reading some literature. There are most definitely more and more books on the subject of restorative practice. One that I just recently read is about building a trauma-informed restorative school by Joseph Brummer. And that really has a lot of interesting layers and components in terms of restorative practices that I don't think I had really seen before. I had done a lot of work on trauma responsive teaching and research practices, but this book really marries the two, a really useful resource for educators teaching students with ADHD or any other special needs text. The Restorative Journey by Dr. Malik Muhammad is another good foundational text. If you're at the beginning of your restorative journey as an educator, that might be the first book I would recommend to clarify some misconceptions about who restorative is meant for. Who it's meant for is everyone. If you're a human being, it doesn't matter a label, a diagnosis, a need. It's meant for human beings, period. And so there's a way to make that accessible to all human beings. We just have to be willing to see that way.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if there's something I've missed, if there's something you would want to add about restorative practices and maybe what schools can do and how they can support kids.
I think the only other thing that I would add is making sure that students with ADHD and other special needs are getting the opportunity not only to experience restorative practices, but to lead them with classmates, and to not underestimate students' ability or natural capacity to really be able to be leaders in that type of work. I think that that's just another piece that I would want educators to really think about, paying attention to students that you might not have thought would be able to step into a role of leading restorative work in your school community, and really making sure to consider what they may be able to bring to restorative practices in terms of leading, being a leader amongst their peers.
Thank you so much, Angelica, for sharing your valuable insights and experiences today. For our listeners, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, please send them to unstitchingadhd@gmail.com. We appreciate your feedback and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for tuning in to Unstitching ADHD Urban Ed Talks. Until next time, take care and keep supporting our students.